Arnold Schwarzenegger has been living with a heart condition since before he became famous. Though most people are unaware of it, he was born in Thale, Austria, in 1947. In his early years, doctors identified an abnormality in his heart, a congenital defect called a bicuspid aortic valve. A normal aortic valve has 3 leaflets, his had 2. The condition affects roughly 1 to 2% of the population. In many cases, people live with it for decades without serious consequence. In others, the valve gradually deteriorates, narrowing or leaking over time, placing increasing strain on the heart. For Schwarzenegger, the valve held through his bodybuilding career, his acting career, and his time as governor of California. In 1997, at age 49, it reached a point where it required replacement. He underwent open heart surgery, a procedure in which surgeons stop the heart, open the chest, and operate on the valve directly. He spoke about it publicly at the time, but it did not become a defining part of his public narrative. He recovered, returned to work, continued making films, ran for governor, and served 2 terms. For the better part of 2 decades, the surgery faded from public consciousness. The image of Schwarzenegger as an exceptional physical specimen was well established, and a heart condition did not fit that picture. In 2018, at age 70, he required emergency open heart surgery again. The replacement valve from 1997, a pulmonic valve inserted to extend his heart's function, had developed a serious complication. According to reports at the time, he was taken to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The procedure was unplanned and urgent. He survived. People close to him have said in subsequent interviews that the 2018 surgery was a genuine crisis, one in which the outcome was uncertain, and those around him waited without knowing what the next few hours would bring. In the aftermath, something shifted in his thinking. The first surgery at 49 was one he could move past relatively quickly. He was younger, and he did recover and continue at the same pace. The second surgery at 70, an emergency operation on a heart that had already been through one major procedure, carried a different weight. It prompted, by his own account, a serious reassessment of his habits and the physical demands he was placing on his body. The changes he made afterward were largely unexpected to those who had known him throughout his career. To understand the significance of what he changed, it helps to first understand what his diet looked like before. The bodybuilding world of the 1970s had little patience for nutritional nuance. The prevailing philosophy was straightforward. Building mass required eating mass. Protein was the priority, fat was acceptable, and carbohydrates were a subject of ongoing debate among trainers, while most athletes simply filled their plates and trained. During his competitive years, roughly 1966 to 1975, when he dominated the Mr. Olympia and Mr. Universe competitions, Arnold followed a high-volume, high-protein approach to eating. He and his training partners consumed multiple meals a day, each built around dense animal protein: chicken, tuna, whole eggs, not just whites because the fat in the yolk was considered nutritionally necessary, and above all, red meat, steak, primarily, sometimes more than once a day. By the standards of the time, the reasoning held up. Red meat delivers complete protein with all essential amino acids. It's calorie-dense, which matters when fueling hours of daily training. It contains creatine naturally, supports muscle performance, and is rich in zinc and iron. For a young athlete trying to build the most muscular physique in competitive bodybuilding history, it was a logical foundation. Whole milk, full-fat cottage cheese, hard cheeses, these were dietary staples, not occasional additions. When consuming 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day to support muscle growth, calorie-dense foods that are easy to prepare and digest serve a practical purpose, and full-fat dairy fit that profile. Processed meat products were also part of the picture, though this aspect is less frequently discussed. Arnold grew up in Austria, where cured meats, sausages, bacon, dried beef are a fixture of the food culture. For him, these weren't simply protein sources. They were familiar foods tied to his upbringing. Even as his public profile grew, certain foods carried a cultural and personal significance that existed independently of their nutritional value. Layered on top of all of this was the supplement culture of the era. Protein powders, liver tablets, amino acid capsules. The 1970s bodybuilding scene was, in many respects, an early form of performance self-experimentation. Athletes testing various products on themselves with limited regulatory oversight and often limited scientific support for the claims being made. Through all of it, Arnold competed at a body weight of around 235 pounds with body fat estimated in the single digits, a combination of size and leanness that had not been achieved before at that scale. He won Mr. Olympia 7 times. The diet he followed wasn't incidental to those results, it was central to them. For that period, it worked. The problem with the invincibility mindset, the belief that hard work can offset whatever damage is being done, is that it assumes the damage is happening to something visible, to muscles, to joints, to recovery time. What it doesn't account for is the slow, invisible process occurring inside the arteries, the plaque that accumulates over years of dietary habits, the cumulative stress on a cardiovascular system that was already compromised from birth. Arnold didn't feel it developing. Most people don't. The condition progresses without symptoms. You feel well, you appear to be in exceptional shape, and in the meantime, something is quietly narrowing inside the chest that no amount of physical training can address. His doctors had been advising him to change his diet for years before the 2018 surgery. He has said as much in interviews, but when someone has spent an entire life overcoming doubt, when their identity is built on the conviction that will is stronger than limitation, it becomes genuinely difficult to accept medical guidance that requires abandoning the habits associated with everything they've built. The 2018 surgery resolved that resistance in a way that conversation had not. What followed was a version of Arnold Schwarzenegger that few in the fitness world had anticipated. Of everything Arnold Schwarzenegger has eliminated from his diet in recent years, red meat carries the most weight, not simply because it was a food he preferred, but because it had been foundational to his identity as an athlete. After the 2018 surgery, his cardiologists were direct. The saturated fat in red meat, particularly the cuts he had favored, ribeyes, sirloin steaks, and the ground beef he had consumed in substantial quantities during his competitive years, was a contributing factor to the arterial plaque buildup that had complicated his cardiac situation. The guidance was not framed in general terms. His physicians showed him imaging, walked him through data specific to his cardiovascular system, and told him plainly that continuing his existing diet was accelerating a problem that had already put him on an operating table twice. He has discussed this in his newsletter, in podcast appearances, and in his documentary work. The move away from red meat was not immediate. It was gradual, reluctant, and by his own account, genuinely difficult in ways that had little to do with willpower. There is a distinction between giving up something enjoyed and giving up something that represents a sense of self. Arnold's relationship with red meat extended back to his adolescence in Austria, where his family had limited means and a good piece of meat at the table marked a degree of prosperity. When he came to America and achieved success, eating well, eating generously became part of how he understood that success. The steak dinners, the steakhouses shared with other figures in Hollywood and the entertainment industry, the quiet routine of a well-prepared cut of meat after a demanding training session. Stripping red meat from his diet wasn't simply a dietary adjustment. It required a fundamental reassessment of what he was prepared to give up in order to protect his health. What he replaced it with reflects how seriously he approached that change. He moved toward plant-based proteins, lentils, chickpeas, black beans, and specific fish, particularly varieties lower in mercury and higher in omega-3 fatty acids, such as salmon and sardines. He has spoken openly about eating eggs in moderation, describing them as a practical compromise that provides animal protein without the cardiovascular burden of red meat. He also incorporated plant-based protein powders into his routine, products he has been willing to endorse publicly, something he would not have considered during his bodybuilding years. If eliminating red meat was the emotionally difficult part of the transition, cutting full-fat dairy was the logistically demanding one. Dairy, whole milk, heavy cream, butter, full-fat cheese was embedded in nearly every meal of Arnold's classic diet, often less conspicuously than the meat on his plate. The bodybuilding culture of the 1970s treated dairy as close to essential. Whole milk carried an almost mythological status in training circles. Duo mad gallon of milk a day was a protocol that circulated among lifters seeking rapid mass gain, and while Arnold did not follow it strictly, whole milk and full-fat dairy products were consistent features of his eating. Cottage cheese was a regular dinner. Butter was a standard cooking fat. Hard cheeses added caloric density to meals. These were not occasional indulgences. They were foundational elements of how he ate. Following his 2018 surgery, his cardiologist's concern with full-fat dairy was specific. It is among the most potent dietary drivers of LDL cholesterol elevation in people with cardiovascular risk factors. LDL, commonly referred to as bad cholesterol, is the lipoprotein responsible for depositing cholesterol into arterial walls, contributing to the plaques that narrow arteries over time. In most healthy individuals, the body manages this process adequately. For someone with a compromised heart valve and a history of arterial problems, however, each meal that raises LDL adds incrementally to a condition that had already required emergency intervention. Saturated fat is the primary dietary driver of LDL elevation, and full-fat dairy is one of its most concentrated sources in the Western diet. A single ounce of full-fat cheese can contain 5 to 6 grams of saturated fat. A tablespoon of butter contains 7. Across the multiple daily meals Arnold had long maintained, those figures accumulate quickly. By his own account, avoiding full-fat dairy proved harder to sustain than eliminating red meat. Dairy is present in sauces, in restaurant cooking, and in the prepared foods and protein bars that many people depend on. Managing around it requires a level of consistent vigilance that most people are unaccustomed to, and for someone with Arnold's dietary history, the absence of familiar textures and flavors served as a persistent reminder of what had changed. What he landed on, publicly, was a shift toward plant-based dairy alternatives. He's mentioned oat milk specifically as a replacement he adapted to more quickly than expected, along with almond-based products and certain plant-based cheeses, though his position on those has been more ambivalent. More broadly, the rich, creamy quality that full-fat dairy brings to food gave way to a lighter approach to cooking, one he's described in various interviews as an adjustment that took longer than I expected. Bacon, deli turkey, salami, smoked sausages, hot dogs, pepperoni, these are the foods that make up the processed and cured meat category. They're also, somewhat paradoxically, the foods most aggressively marketed to people pursuing high-protein, low-carb diets. For Arnold, this category carried a cultural weight that went beyond fitness. He grew up in Austria, where cured meats are not simply convenient food, they're a culinary tradition. Wurst in its many regional varieties. Speck, the dry-cured smoked ham that anchors Alpine cooking. Cold cuts served on bread, in sandwiches, at breakfast. These were the flavors of his childhood, and they carried into adulthood with the kind of emotional authority that only early food memories tend to hold. His cardiologist's concerns about processed and cured meats differed from their concerns about red meat or dairy. Saturated fat is present, but it wasn't the primary issue. The main concerns were sodium and nitrates. Arnold has spoken about this particular change with a wry honesty that characterizes how he discusses his dietary adjustments generally. He doesn't frame it as easy, and he doesn't present it as a welcome revelation. He describes it as something his doctors told him he needed to do, something he has done, and something he's occasionally aware of when eating something else. The cured meats were bound up in his identity. The Austrian who built a life in America without fully leaving his homeland's food behind, and removing them from his diet was a quieter loss than the steak, but a genuine one. For the savory umami depth that cured meats provide, he's described a combination of substitutes across various interviews, certain fish prepared with assertive seasoning, mushrooms for their natural savoriness, and fermented plant-based foods that offer flavor complexity without the cardiovascular burden. He's been clear that it isn't the same, but that it works well enough to be livable. At 78, livable is the point.